Lisa Grant thought she had Barron Trump cornered. She wanted a headline, a scandal. But what she got instead, a response so powerful, it left the entire studio speechless. What did Barron say that changed everything? Stay till the end, because this moment will leave you in shock. If you love seeing truth prevail, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's dive in. Sometimes the best way to dismantle deception is with intelligence. At a high-profile charity gala, the air was thick with the hum of polite conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the subtle exchange of power among the elite. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and well-rehearsed smiles, something else was brewing. A trap carefully set in motion by a man with an agenda, a journalist perhaps, but Michael Reynolds was more than just a reporter. He was an operative with deep political ties. A man who had spent weeks preparing for this moment, crafting every question like a blade meant to cut deep tonight. His target wasn't just any public figure, it was Tiffany Trump. He had every advantage, a meticulously planned attack, strategically placed cameras, and an audience eager for controversy. He expected an easy takedown. What he didn't expect was Barron Trump, not just his presence, but his razor-sharp composure. His ability to turn the tables before the first strike. Even landed Reynolds came prepared for a fight, but what he walked into was a battle of wit, facts, and an opponent far more formidable than he had imagined. Stick around, because this is a moment you won't want to miss. The Washington, D.C. Philanthropy Gala was in full swing. The grand ballroom shimmered beneath a canopy of chandeliers, their golden glow casting soft halos over a sea of designer-clad elites. Crystal flutes of champagne sparkled in manicured hands as conversations wove through the air. Some light, some calculated, all part of the intricate dance of power that night. Like these demanded among the esteemed guests stood Tiffany, Trump poised and effortlessly radiant. In a sleek evening gown, her polished smile betraying none of the scrutiny that often shadowed her last name, engaging graciously with event sponsors. She moved through the room with the ease of someone well-versed in the art of public life. Not far from her, Barron Trump loomed over the crowd, his six frame, making him an unmistakable presence. Unlike his sister, he preferred the quiet edges of the spotlight, observing rather than engaging, speaking only when necessary. Yet despite his usual detachment, he was always there when it mattered most, and tonight he would be needed more than ever. Unbeknownst to them, lurking in the crowd was Michael Reynolds, a journalist for the Daily Progressive. At least that was his official title to those in his inner circle. He was much more than that. A strategist, a tactician, a man with a mission that extended far beyond journalism. For weeks, he had been waiting for this opportunity, working in tandem with key figures from a well-funded political machine that thrived on scandal and spectacle. This wasn't just a story. It was a calculated hit designed to chip away at the public perception of the Trump family. Reynolds had an agenda, and Tiffany Trump was the perfect mark. His team was already in position, a discreetly placed camera crew, an arsenal of loaded questions, carefully crafted to spark controversy, and a strategy built for maximum damage. The goal wasn't just to corner her, but to force a reaction, to catch her off guard in a moment that would be played and replayed across every news cycle for days. He had already planned the headline. Tiffany Trump exposed at charity gala. As Tiffany turned to speak with another guest, Reynolds saw his chance. He closed the distance in an instant, his signature smirk firmly in place, microphone held like a dagger. He had waited weeks for this moment, and now, in the golden glow of the chandeliers, with cameras subtly rolling, he was about to make it count. Trump. His voice rang out, cutting clean through the hum of polite conversation, ensuring that every ear within range caught the moment the ambush began. Can I ask you something about your family's charitable work? Tiffany, composed as ever, turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Of course, Reynolds didn't waste a second. Your family has built its wealth on corruption, exploitation, and self-interest. So how do you justify standing here tonight, dressed in luxury, sipping champagne and pretending to care about the less fortunate? Isn't philanthropy just a PR stunt for the Trump, an attempt to launder your family's reputation? While real Americans struggled, the words landed like a thunderclap. The shift in the room was immediate. Sharp conversations died mid-sentence, glasses paused halfway to lips. Some guests exchanged stunned glances, others leaned in, eager for the inevitable reaction. Tiffany's practiced smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, and that was all Reynolds wanted to crack. A moment of hesitation, a sign of unease that he could sink his teeth into. But before she could even draw breath to answer, a new presence entered the frame. Barron Trump, tall, composed, and completely unshaken. He took a step forward, his deep voice, calm and composed, broke through the tense atmosphere. "With all due respect," Barron said, his gaze steady as he addressed Reynolds, "would you say the same thing about other philanthropists? Or is it just the Trump name that concerns you for a split?" Second, there was no response. The framing of the question forced Reynolds into a corner. If he admitted that billionaires outside the Trump family also leveraged philanthropy for influence, his attack would lose its sting. If he claimed that only the Trumps did this, he would expose himself as biased. Reynolds smirked, clearly trying to maintain control. "Well," he said, "your family is known for prioritizing wealth and business over social issues. Wouldn't you agree?" Barron didn't hesitate. Wealth in business create jobs. They fund hospitals, scholarships, disaster relief efforts. The difference is whether you measure impact or just headlines. The crowd stirred. Reynolds pressed forward. "But isn't it fair to question whether your family's philanthropy is just for image management?" Barron's tone remains steady. "Fair, absolutely, but fairness requires consistency. So let's apply the same scrutiny to every major donor, every billionaire who funds foundations. Would you be willing to do that?" Reynolds hesitated. Without waiting for an answer, Barron reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled briefly. "Interesting perspective," he said, holding up an article from the Daily Progressive itself, displaying a report on the Trump family's extensive charitable contributions, millions donated to children's hospitals, veteran programs, and disaster relief efforts. The crowd murmured in surprise. "You see," Barron continued, his tone, "unwavering philanthropy should be measured by its impact, not by the headlines it generates. If a child receives life-saving treatment because of a donation, does it matter whose name is on the check?" Reynolds shifted slightly but pushed forward. "But isn't it fair to say," he pressed, "that your involvement in these causes is mostly ceremonial, that you're just a carefully placed face at high-profile events, rather than someone actually doing the work?" Barron didn't blink. "Are you suggesting that attending events to raise funds for hospitals and veterans is meaningless? Would those programs be better off without the donations?" Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second. An opening Barron immediately seized. "Let me ask you this," Barron said, tilting his head slightly. "If your publication reported on these same donations without the Trump name attached, would it still be framed as a PR stunt?" The room was silent. "Olden, you agree?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, but pressed on. "But surely you understand the perception of privilege here." Reynolds' tone was firm, carefully laced with implication rather than accusation. The unspoken message: "Your wealth discredits your generosity." Barron remained unfazed. He didn't flinch, didn't bristle. He analyzed. "Privilege exists. No one is denying that," he said plainly. "But let's talk about what that really means." A pause, a deliberate shift. Reynolds had framed privilege as a stained Barron was about to redefine it. Privilege isn't about having an advantage. It's about what you do with it. He let the words settle before continuing. If someone is born into wealth and chooses to do nothing, that's entitlement. If they use their position to drive change, that's responsibility. The argument was no longer about the Trumps. It was about a universal principle. Reynolds pressed forward. That's easy to say when you've never faced the struggles of everyday Americans. Your family's wealth places you in a position that most will never have access to. Doesn't that make it easier for you to be charitable? Barron nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the tactic before dismantling it. If wealth makes philanthropy easier, shouldn't we expect more from those who have it, or do we only question it? When the last name is Trump, the shift in the room was subtle but undeniable. Reynolds had attempted to turn privilege into a weakness. Instead, Barron had made it a responsibility. The journalist hesitated. The next words had to be carefully chosen, sensing the momentum shifting. He tried to redirect the conversation. So you're saying there's no privilege involved? Barron remained composed, his expression unreadable. He had anticipated this shift in the argument. The moment when criticism of privilege turned into an attack on intent, Reynolds didn't wait for an answer. Your family's philanthropy is well documented, but let's be honest, most of those donations go to organizations tied to Trump businesses or allies. Isn't that just a way to consolidate power under the guise of charity? The accusation hung in the air. Barron didn't flinch. You're suggesting that philanthropy is only valid when it benefits strangers, that supporting causes you're personally invested in makes it any less impactful? Reynolds opened his mouth, but Barron didn't pause long enough for him to interrupt. Would you say the same about Warren Buffett, donating to education, about Bill Gates, funding global health initiatives, or does this argument only apply to my family? The journalist hesitated. The logical trap was closing in. I'm saying privilege is what you make of it. Barron continued, his tone even deliberate. You can stand on the sidelines and criticize, or you can actually contribute to making a difference. If my family uses its resources to help, is the real issue that we're giving or that you don't like who's giving? Reynolds had a response ready, but as he opened his mouth, he found himself at a loss for words. Well, Reynolds stammered, visibly searching for a way to regain control. Some might argue that your family's wealth has shielded you from the realities most Americans face. Do you believe the average person can relate to your experiences? Barron smiled, politely sensing the shift. This wasn't just a question. It was an attempt to reframe the entire conversation, to push the narrative back into Reynolds' hands. I believe that challenges come in different forms for everyone, he said, his tone steady, but the key isn't how we compare experiences. It's how we use them to create positive change, the crowd murmured, several heads nodding in agreement. Barron wasn't just deflecting accusations. He was reshaping the discussion itself. But before the moment could settle, a voice cut through the crowd. That's a great, rehearsed answer. Someone interjected. All eyes turned toward the speaker, a well-dressed woman near the back of the room, a political analyst, known for her frequent critiques of the Trump administration. She took a step forward, her voice clear and confident. But let's be honest, your family has never faced systemic struggles. Can you genuinely claim to understand the challenges of working-class Americans? A ripple of tension spread through the room. Reynolds, now, with reinforcements, regained his confidence. He gestured toward her. A fair point, he said smoothly. Empathy is important, but can privilege truly allow for understanding? The trap was being set again, but Barron didn't flinch. He glanced toward his sister, seeing the silent reassurance in Tiffany's composed expression. She trusted him to handle this. Tiffany, standing beside him, remained composed, but allowed a proud smile to appear as her brother continued to disarm the journalist. But isn't it fair to say that your family has had numerous controversies that overshadow any good deeds. Reynolds wasn't alone anymore. His political ally, the woman who had spoken up earlier, stood at his side. Now arms crossed, poised to reinforce every word. This wasn't a conversation. It was a setup. Barron immediately saw through it. He remained unfazed. Every public figure, especially those who strive to make an impact, faces criticism. He said, his voice unwavering, but what matters most is the work being done. He let the words settle for a moment before continuing, turning the question back onto them. Are we discussing philanthropy, or are we shifting the conversation to scandal? Because if the goal is to talk about impact, then let's talk about it. A pause. Reynolds hesitated. So did his ally. Barron didn't give them time to recover. Have you looked at the scholarship programs, the veteran support initiatives, or the millions donated to healthcare and education? The room wasn't just watching anymore. They were listening. The female challenger stepped forward, and yet she pressed. Your family's donations seemed to conveniently align with business interests. If philanthropy was truly the goal, wouldn't the money go elsewhere? Barron turned to face her directly. That's an interesting take, he said smoothly. Tell me what exactly defines acceptable philanthropy. Should people only be allowed to support causes they have no connection to? Wouldn't that make charity impersonal, more about image than impact? She opened her mouth, but he was already closing the trap. You see, Barron continued, lifting his phone once again. Facts are stubborn things, and when you focus only on half the picture, you end up misleading your audience. A flick of his fingers, in a list of verified statistics, appeared figures detailing the Trump family's charitable contributions, the impact of their donations and testimonials from organizations that had benefited. He turned the screen toward them. Have you considered sharing this side of the story with your readers? The room shifted. This wasn't just about Barron defending himself anymore. It was about exposing the political agenda unfolding in real time. This isn't about donations. It's about influence and power. Reynolds spoke quickly, hoping to shift the battlefield. The argument about philanthropy had slipped from his hands. Now he was grasping at the idea that power itself, when attached to the Trump name, must be inherently corrupt. Barron nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Influence can be used for good or bad, he said, voice steady. We choose to use ours, to help others, to contribute, and to support meaningful causes. And what about you, Mr. Reynolds? Reynolds frowned slightly. What do you mean? How do you use your influence? The question landed like a hammer. The weight of it was undeniable. For the first time, the audience wasn't looking at Barron. They were looking at Reynolds. Reynolds blinked, the briefest hesitation betraying his unease. I report the news, he finally muttered. Barron didn't let him off the hook. And does reporting the news include presenting both sides fairly, or just the side that gets more clicks? The hush that followed was suffocating. Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came. He knew the trap he had walked into. If he said yes, he would be admitting that his coverage had been one-sided. If he said no, he would be undermining the very credibility of his profession. His fingers tightened around the microphone. The sheen of confidence he had exuded earlier was gone. Barron let the silence stretch just long enough. Then he continued. The truth is, influence exists everywhere. Media, politics, corporations. But the question isn't whether someone has influence, it's how they use it. So, let's be clear. He tilted his head slightly. If a journalist uses influence to shape public perception rather than inform it, are they any different from the power players they claim to hold accountable? Reynolds swallowed. His face was thought, his throat visibly tightening. Barron pressed on, his tone as calm as ever. I understand that controversy sells, that headlines need a villain, that selective framing can turn generosity into corruption or turn any action into a scandal. if you try hard enough, but don't you think the public deserves to see the full picture? Rather than a one-sided narrative, the audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were re-evaluating everything. Reynolds let out a forked chuckle, shifting his stance. He wanted to counter, but how every possible response only highlighted his bias further. For the first time all night, he looked like the one being interviewed. "Thank you for your time," Reynolds said hastily, forcing a tight smile before turning away and disappearing into the crowd. The moment he left, applause erupted. What had begun as a carefully planned takedown had ended as a public humiliation. Guest stepped forward, shaking Barron's hand, commending him for his restraint and intelligence. "That was impressive," one attendee remarked. "You didn't just defend your family, you exposed their entire game." Tiffany placed a hand on her brother's arm, her voice warm. "I think my brother has made an excellent point," she said with grace. "We welcome honest conversations, but fairness and respect should always come first." Barron chuckled, his expression calm. "Sometimes the best way to dismantle a narrative is with facts, not outrage." That night, social media exploded. Videos of the exchange flooded every platform. Hashtags like Barron shuts them down and facts over fiction trended within hours. Even news outlets, typically critical of the Trump family, had to admit that Barron's calm, logical responses were commendable. Meanwhile, Reynolds' attempted ambush had the opposite effect. His network, once confident in their viral hit, found themselves facing backlash for biased reporting. Public scrutiny mounted, an editorial later surfaced, subtly acknowledging the misstep. "We should have done more research before approaching Tiffany Trump." Barron Trump's measured response reminds us all of the importance of fair journalism, but the true damage ran deeper than just one journalist's career. Reynolds wasn't acting alone. For weeks, he had been coordinating with a political faction determined to weaken the Trump family's influence through media manipulation, targeted narratives, and well-timed controversies. This gala had been meant to be their biggest victory, yet a perfectly staged moment designed to plant doubt-fuel headlines and dominate the public discourse. Instead, their entire strategy imploded. The viral moment they had counted on, it happened, but not in the way they planned. Instead of the fall of the Trump name, the public saw a young leader dismantle their arguments piece by piece, exposing not just bias, but a deeper agenda. Reynolds was the first casualty faced with mounting backlash in intern pressure. He quietly took a leave of absence, his credibility in tatters, but behind the scenes the ripple effect was far greater. Meetings were held. Calls were made. The faction that had bankrolled this operation scrambled to contain the fallout. Their strategy had not only failed, it had been turned against them. Some moments aren't just interviews, they're wake-up calls. Barron Trump didn't just defend his mother, he exposed the truth and proved that grace, intelligence, and integrity always win. This story is a reminder that real strength isn't about being the loudest, it's about standing firm in what you believe. If this story inspired you, don't forget to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's keep sharing powerful stories that matter. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay true, and see you in the next video. Wishing you all the best.